Hello friends. So today what we're doing is we're taking a look at a pair of papers from Dirk Pereboom and another one from Patricia Churchland. So what we're going to do in this video, right in this clip, is we're going to talk about Pereboom's paper, Determinism al dente, and then in the next clip we'll talk about Churchland's piece from Touching a Nerve. So let's again situate what we're doing both within the sort of in the context of this week, plus the context of the course as a whole. So today what we're doing is we're taking a look at Dirk, first we're taking a look at, Pereboom and Churchland's pieces, where they offer a different understanding of the idea of responsibility. In a way, so what Pereboom, as we're going to see, what Pereboom tries to do is he tries to show us that even if we're determinists, we can hold on to our ordinary idea about responsibility. And what Churchland does is, she doesn't come out and say it directly, but what I take her to be saying in her piece is that we can replace the notion of responsibility with a biologically more tractable notion of self-control. That is, responsibility for Churchland is going to be sort of this fuzzy concept, but a concept that is substantially less fuzzy, at least from a biological point of view, is that of self-control. And so we ought to sort of displace responsibility with the idea of self-control. Right? So that's what these two thinkers are up to today. In the context of what we've been doing this week, we find that they fit into this, they're fitting into this pattern of questioning whether we need responsibility, or excuse me, whether we need free will in order to make sense of the idea of responsibility. Right? We said that part of the package view isn't that connection between free will and responsibility, right? That a robust sense of free will is part of the package view, but the connection to responsibility isn't necessarily part of that package view. Nonetheless, it's a really intuitive idea, right? That you're only responsible for those things that you perform freely. So what we're taking a look at today is we're taking a look at yet another way to challenge this received view, this Cartesian, Platonic view that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. So with that in mind, let's get to it. So, Pereboom. Pereboom is a philosopher whose position is often described as hard determinism. So what is hard determinism? Well, as you might gather, it's a deterministic view. But it's a bit different from Spinoza's deterministic view. So you'll recall that Spinoza thinks that there's no such thing as free will, and we are determined to do whatever it is that we're going to do, right? We act of necessity is the way that Spinoza puts it. For Pereboom, we don't have free will, but whether or not we are determined is an empirical hypothesis, right? So whether or not determinism is true is not something that can be settled by philosophical speculation. That determinism, whether or not determinism is true, is a claim that's going to be settled by the sciences, right? Not a priori by philosophers, but a posteriori through tough scientific investigation. So hard determinists believe, A, that there's no such thing as free will, and B, that we may or may not be determined. Okay, so what's Pereboom doing in this particular piece that I asked you to read for today, or the chunk of the piece that I asked you to read for today? Well, first I should say that Pereboom is doing some pretty hardcore metaphysics of mind, so kudos to you for reading it, because Pereboom is dealing with some really challenging concepts, but nothing to be afraid of. So what's he worried about? Well, we have three things here that we're taking a look at. So the first one is that if hard determinism is right, then our deliberations make no difference, right? So Pereboom's going to take a look at that and say that that's not the case. Second, if hard determinism is right, then moral praise and blame make no sense. He's going to say that that's right, but that's really not such a bad thing. Finally, he's going to tell us, or he's going to take a look at the claim that if hard determinism is right, then we can't make sense of claims like, even though you didn't choose some course of action, you ought to have chosen that course of action. So in other words, being able to say to somebody that even though they didn't do something, they ought to have done it. Or if they did do something, they ought to have refrained from it. So how hard determinism is inconsistent with that is going to be is something we need to unpack, but we'll get to that in just a few minutes. So let's take the first couple of issues first. So the first one, if hard determinism is right, then our deliberations make no difference whatsoever. Right? So why should we think that in the first place? Well, suppose that we don't have free will, and we may or may not be determined. Well, if we don't have free will, then whatever we deliberate about, right, whatever we sort of struggle with, right, that really doesn't make a difference because we're not the ones actually making the choice. Right? So suppose for a second that you have to that you're struggling to choose between going to two different universities, right? You're thinking about going to Gonzaga, but maybe you're also thinking about going to like St. Mary's. So when you're thinking, right, when you're making this decision, you're struggling with it, right? You've got reasons pro and con for both sides, right? You're going back and forth about it. Ultimately, you have to make a decision, right? You deliberate on the reasons pro and con for each side, but, you know, at some point you have to decide which university you're going to. Well, the idea that deliberating does anything for us presumes that we are free to choose whatever it is, whatever university we go to. But if we aren't free, and therefore aren't free to choose, then why would we bother deliberating in the first place? The deliberation itself makes no difference, right? It's just sort of a flopping around, but all that flopping around doesn't make a damn bit of difference in the world because you don't actually get to choose because there's no free will, there's no choice. How does it work? Not quite sure yet. Maybe something goes on in the brain that makes us choose. Maybe it's God, maybe it's the Big Bang, who knows, right? But whatever it is, it's not you. So, the critic of hard determinism says, if hard determinism is right, then deliberations don't make any difference whatsoever, right? Which seems kind of weird. So, what does Pereboom do about this? Well, in this case, he wants to reject the claim. He wants to say that hard determinism is right, and yet our deliberations do make a difference. So how does he do this? Well, what he says is that our actions come about from our choices, right? So the things on which we decide, right, whether or not the decision is determined or not, right? Set that fact aside for a moment, right? Your actions are determined by the things you choose to do, right? By the decisions you make. Right? Again, whether or not those decisions are free is a separate issue, right? But right now, just recognize actions you perform, product of choices you make. The choices you make are sort of determined, or for lack of a better term, are determined by your deliberations. So, our deliberations do make a difference, because when you deliberate, that compels you to choose, and when you choose, you are compelled to act. So our deliberating is just another step in that causal chain, right? In that sequence of actions leading, or the sequence of events leading up to the action, right? You deliberate, you choose, you act. So it's simply false that our deliberations don't make a difference. They do make a difference, because without the deliberations, we wouldn't choose, and without the choice, we wouldn't act. So it's simply false to think that deliberations don't matter. So, that was the first one. if determinism is right, then our deliberations make no difference. Pereboom says, nope, totally wrong. Our deliberations do make a difference. In fact, without the deliberating, we wouldn't be able to choose an action in the first place. Or there would be no choice and no subsequent action. Okay. Second point. The second point that Pereboom addresses is, if hard determinism is right, then moral praise and blame make no sense. Why think this? Well, again, this was kind of an intuitive one. The idea is that we merit praise and blame. We deserve praise and blame because of our free choices, right? So, if you help an old person across the street with his or her groceries, and you do it freely, we praise you for that, right? And you merit that praise not just because you've done something good, but because you've chosen to do something good. Right? So imagine I see you helping somebody across the street with their groceries, right? And I say, oh, dude, awesome. You are such a generous person. And you say to me, in a fit of honesty, you say, well, you know, if I hadn't done this, then that nice old person over there would have murdered my family, right? First of all, it'd be kind of weirded out that an old person would threaten to murder your family. But secondly, I wouldn't praise you as much, right? In fact, I don't think that's a praiseworthy action at all. Right? You didn't do it because you chose to help this person. You were coerced into helping them. And coerced helping isn't really praiseworthy helping, I think. That seems pretty intuitive. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Like a solid 80%. Right? I'd be interested to hear what you think on the discussion boards. So praise and blame are merited by free choice. And if we don't have free choice, if hard determinism is right, then our practices of blaming and praising people are pointless. So Pereboom says, so Pereboom in thinking about this goes, yeah, that's a deep and difficult problem. So one thing he does, or one option he considers is to say, well, people, strictly speaking, are neither praiseworthy nor blameworthy. But we can treat them as if they were praiseworthy or blameworthy. So in other words, we don't really think of people as meriting praise or blame, but we act as though they merit these things. So that's one route, right, is to say that we sort of make up, right, there's no foundation in reality for holding people praiseworthy or blameworthy. Right? So Pereboom considers this, but it seems really weird, right? I mean, if you have no basis in reality for holding people blameworthy, then why on earth would you do it? Right? So Pereboom says rather strongly that this is, well, it's kind of irrational. Right? Well, not kind of, right? He says straightforwardly, this is an irrational thing to do. He says, furthermore, he says that the hard determinist is committed to saying that that people can't be held praiseworthy or blameworthy, right? So he wants to say, look, we don't want to just talk about it as though, we don't want to have just mere talk here, right? We want to, in a sense, we want to shift around our moral practices to fit what we think about the nature of reality. So, what's his suggestion? He says, well, let's not think about people's actions or people as praiseworthy or blameworthy. Here's what we ought to do. What we ought to do is use practices of admonishing certain actions and encouraging certain actions. So what we do is we abandon ideas about praiseworthy and blameworthy actions and people. And we replace those ideas of praise and blame with admonishment and encouragement. So, what does this do for us, right? What does the swap accomplish? Well, through practices of admonishment and encouragement, and what we're doing is we're communicating a sense of what's right and wrong. But what we're doing is we're letting go of holding people responsible, right? We see, in a sense, we see people as being able to be molded one way or another, right? Rather than simply being bearers of responsibility. So the way to think about it is you perform an action, and when I hold you responsible on Pereboom's view, what I'm doing is it's like I'm sticking a little tag on you that says you're responsible for this, you're responsible for that, you're responsible for that, right? So you become like a sort of a thing on which I can hang responsibility, right? I mean, again, think. Hume says this too, right? That that we hang responsibility on character, right? That we need some idea about character in order to make sense of the idea of responsibility. So Pereboom is doing something really similar there, right? That we think about people as being like bearers of responsibility, right? So you do something, I'm like, you're responsible, right? And I put a little responsibility hat on you, right? Or I put a little responsibility tag on you for an action that you perform for which you're responsible. Right? So what does that do for us? Well, all it really does is tag people as responsibility holders for actions. Does it help make people better? Maybe, maybe not. Because identifying somebody as responsible doesn't communicate very well what we think of right and wrong. So holding people responsible for their actions by saying that the action is praiseworthy or blameworthy, right, or by saying that they are praiseworthy or blameworthy, that doesn't really communicate our sense of right and wrong. All it does is just tag people in actions, right? It's like, that's a thing we like, that's a thing we like, that's a thing we don't like, that's another thing we don't like, right? And you're the one who did the thing that we don't like. We think about admonishment and encouragement. It's much more positive, it's more forward-looking, right? If I encourage somebody for the things that they're doing, I'm not just saying this is a good thing you're doing, but I'm also saying I want you to do more of this, right? I mean, think about when we encourage, when we encourage kids to study hard for a test, right? If they're studying for like, a third grade math test, right? We see them studying and we say, oh, hey, you're doing a great job. You having any trouble, any problems you need some help with, stuff like that. So it's not just saying the studying you're doing is a good thing. It's helping them do the thing that we identify as good, right? And in a sense, providing a pathway for doing it more, right? For doing it better. So encouraging somebody, is different from simply praising a person or praising an action. Encouragement is like active involvement, right? Whereas praising is just sort of saying, hey, we like that. So by engaging in practices of encouragement and admonishment, right? So, pushing people forward into doing the things we want them to do through encouragement, and giving reasons for not doing something in the case of admonishment. What we're doing is we're sort of looking forward, right? We're being progressive here. We want people to do the things that we value and not do the things that we disvalue. So, how are these practices consistent with the hard determinist? Well, here's how. When we encourage people, we actually affect their deliberations. And when we admonish people, we likewise affect their deliberations. So, what we're doing then is we are like shaping that deliberation process, which leads to choices, which leads to action. So practices of admonishment and encouragement are perfectly consistent with what Pereboom has said so far about hard determinism. Right? So he has this really interesting note, or this interesting blurb he has towards the end of that section. He says that our attitudes towards particularly appalling actions, right? So you might think of like mass murders, right, or things like torture or rape, right? Really, truly atrocious, morally atrocious actions. He says that our attitudes towards those are like our attitudes towards earthquakes and tornadoes, right? we deplore them. We find them saddening and terrible, and we are crushed by the loss and the suffering. But really, it makes no sense to ascribe responsibility in these cases, right? I mean, these were terrible things that happened, but I mean, saying that the person is responsible doesn't really do anything, right? I mean, saying that a person is responsible for a mass murder is kind of like saying that a tornado is responsible for destroying somebody's house. It's like, okay, well, I guess, but that doesn't really help us out moving forward, right? We already, right, when we say that a person is responsible, we're saying that they did the thing that they did, right? But we don't just want to assign responsibility, right? Again, I know that the tornado destroyed my house. I saw it happen, right? That doesn't help me moving forward. What will help me moving forward, in the case of the mass murderer, but not in the case of the tornado, obviously, is admonishment, right? Identifying this action as wrong and punishing it accordingly, right? So responsibility isn't what we're really interested in. What we're really interested in is admonishment in this case. Okay, so the second point we considered is, if hard determinism is right, then moral praise and blame just make no sense whatsoever. And Pereboom's like, yeah, that's legit. And he tries to replace our ideas about praise and blame and responsibility with ideas about admonishment and encouragement. So what's the final thing? Well, the final thing to consider is, if hard determinism is right, then claims like, even though you didn't do such and such, you ought to have done such and such, right? That claims like that just make no sense. So why would that be the case? Well, let's think about hard determinism for a second. If hard determinism is right, then you didn't freely choose one thing or another, right? There's no free will, there's no free choice, no. So, if you cannot choose to do something, what sense is there in me saying to you that you ought to have chosen differently, right? Because you could legitimately say back to me, no, I mean, that's fine, but I can't, right? Because saying that you can freely choose to do one thing implies that you can freely choose to do something else. But if you can't freely choose to do one thing, then obviously you can't freely choose to do another thing. And so it would be really weird for me to say you ought to have chosen differently when you couldn't have chosen differently, right? So just as a quick example, suppose you're coerced into robbing a bank, right? And we're talking high-level coercion here, right? Somebody's kidnapped your family and will dispense with them if you don't rob the bank. It would make no sense for me to say to you, you ought to have chosen differently, right? Because you could legitimately say to me, well, I didn't choose to rob a bank, right? I have to do this. I'm being coerced into doing it. So if you have no choice, it seems weird to say, or in fact, it's straight out bizarre to say that you ought to have done differently, right? It'd be kind of like saying to a rock that fell off a cliff, you ought not have fallen off the cliff, right? The rock's going to be like, yo, I'm a rock. Got no choices here, right? Okay. So, how does Pereboom deal with this? Well, he says that it might turn out, or he floats this as a possibility. He says, it might be that all ought statements, or all should statements, are false, right? That every time you say, you ought to do something, strictly speaking, that's false, right? Right? It's wrong to say, or it's incorrect to say, you ought to have done this, or you should have done that. Right? So, that is to say, that every statement about our moral activities that has that word ought in it, or should, those sentences, those statements are false. Right? They're as false as, neon blue grass grows in Spokane. Right? They're just false from the neck up, false from the neck down. Right? False. So what do we do then? Right? Well, even though ought statements and should statements are false, we can still retain our moral judgments. So, imagine I say to you, you should give to charity. Strictly speaking, that's false. But what I can do is I can encourage you to give to charity. I can admonish your failure to give to charity. So even though ought statements are false, even though saying you ought to give to charity is false, I can still encourage you to give to charity. I can say, you've got all this dispensable cash, right? You literally have like 20s falling out of your pockets as you walk down the street. Surely somebody could use that money, right? Some of the folks down at the bus station, maybe they could use a hot meal, right? Or I could say, you're thinking about, buying yourself a suit made of diamonds. Well, there are a lot of people all over the world who could take that same money and they could eat for months using that cash. So it's really, a bad thing to spend all of this money on yourself when you could be using it to help other people. So what we can do in this case is abandon the idea that sentences like you ought to give to charity are true, right? They're false across the board. Or you might even say that they're not candidates for being true or false. Maybe they're even meaningless. But what we can do is we can say, what we can do is we can encourage certain kinds of actions and admonish other kinds of actions. So, we replace statements of, I ought to give to charity, or you ought to give to charity, with statements like, it's right to give to charity, or it's wrong to be selfish, right? So we end up replacing all of our ought sentences with sentences about right and wrong. So why is that important? Well, it's important in the sense that it provides us a way for holding on to the idea that we have standards for moral behavior, and that we can retain these standards for moral behavior even if our actions in the world are no different than the actions of everything else in reality. Right? Again, rocks don't have a choice in whether they fall off of cliffs. Maybe we don't have choices either. But just because we don't have choices, that doesn't mean that we abandon our standards of moral behavior.